Welcome everyone to Clear Mountain's weekly Wednesday Q&A and discussion. So I thought we could start today's session just with a brief meditation, just in quiet together, maybe 3 minutes or so. Okay. Welcome everyone. It's good to see old names, old friends. We have a chance now to have our usual discussion. So please feel free to type in any questions you'd like to discuss. And let me know if you can not hear me or anything's wrong with the audio or video. The first question from Sumana. Good evening, all. Glad to be here. I have a lengthy question. In a recent talk by Gil Fronsdale, he mentioned some controversy around whether the Buddha discovered the first four jhanas. He said that the description of the jhana accomplishments of the Buddha previously before his enlightenment under previous teachers correspond to jhanas 7 and 8, and when the Buddha remembers his childhood experience, which seems to correspond to the first jhana, it seems it is a bit of a surprise to him. That is the memory. So from there, he moves to 2, 3, 4. Would like to hear your thoughts on this and also anything about this quote-unquote controversy you might be aware of. My understanding had always been that the jhanas are not unique to Buddhism and thought this meant all of them. Thanks. Sorry for the long list of entries. No, that's a great question and deserves 4 or 5 entries. So, for those who are unaware, there's a beautiful narrative in the Buddha's life where the first teachers he went to, Alara Kalama was his first teacher, and Alara Kalama had mastered the base of nothingness, um, and thought that that was the supreme awakening, the ultimate. The Buddha realized it wasn't and went on in search of another teacher and found a teacher named Uddaka Ramaputta. And Uddaka Ramaputta had mastered the base of, I believe, neither perception nor non-perception. Yes, I think that's true. And yeah, that's a confusing term. So those two, the base of infinity, the base of infinity of space, the base of infinity of consciousness, the base of nothingness, no thingness, and the base of non-perception nor neither perception nor non-perception are in the commentaries, I believe, or at least in later tradition, referred to as jhanas 5 through 8. However, they're never actually spoken of as the jhanas in the suttas. Right concentration in the suttas is the 4 jhanas, 1, 2, 3, 4. And rather, these bases are considered, I believe they're known as attainments, basically, is the word used for them. And there's a significant difference here in that they are somewhat intellectualized. Basically, it comes from, they originate from switching your object from, say, the base of, at least this is what the teachers say, the base of consciousness, and then you sort of, or the base of infinity of space, and then you sort of drop the space and notice the consciousness aware of it. And then even that falls, and there's just sort of this no thingness, and then that falls, and then there's neither perception nor non-perception. Whereas the jhanas, as Ajahn Nisabho says, the first 4 jhanas that are actually referred to as jhana are based in a switching of your relationship to the meditation object. And the narrative in the Buddha's story is very beautiful, actually, because he attains these very profound attainments. And for those who know the story, they'll know that during the last 6 years of his search, or the last year or so, he worked with ascetic practices with extreme devotion, starved himself, held his breath, and almost killed himself from it. And then he has this memory of sitting under the rose apple tree while his father plowed the field and just feeling comfortable and safe. And how in that moment he'd slipped into the first jhana. At least that's what people say about that moment. And then he remembers this and he says, why am I afraid of pleasure? Because his reaching for these high attainments and his punishing himself were all these ways of distancing himself from the body and just pushing. And then the thought arises, and distancing himself from pleasure. And he says, "Why am I afraid of this pleasure which was blameless?" Remembering that moment under the tree. It was a wholesome pleasure of the first jhana. And the thought arises. Um, and he says, there's what is, maybe this is the way to enlightenment. And then it says, the thought arose, this is the way to enlightenment. And the beauty in that verse is, first of all, the thought, it's not he thinks this is the way to enlightenment. It's how it's phrased is the thought arose. And there's moments in the suttas like this where, say in the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, where it speaks about how light arose, vision arose. Um, it's almost like pointing to the fact that suddenly the sense of self isn't strong, and this sort of knowledge bubbles up from something somewhere much deeper. And so after all this striving and pushing, he's just called back to that simple moment of being in his body, safe, secure, and slipping into the state of blameless pleasure. And it's a bit reminds me of what Ajahn Pasano has said, which is that we miss enlightenment because we're always looking past it. Or what Jung had said, in that we miss God because we don't look low enough. And so there's just this beautiful moment of him coming back to this very simple thing, and coming back to his body, because all the metaphors of the jhanas have this embodied sense. All the analogies are either of the, just as a bathman's apprentice needs water into a ball of bath powder, so one pervades this body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, and so on and so forth. They all have to do with the body. So as opposed to these sort of spatial and intellectual attainments, he just comes back to the simple sense of the body. And that's a beautiful motion of the mind. And I think it's one that we can pay attention to in our practice, how we push ourselves and drive ourselves. And so often, practice is about, you work with those energies of, activity, but so often it's coming back to the simple sense of wholesome goodness, and just coming back and being gentle, coming back to the child under the rose apple tree. I think it's such a beautiful narrative. So yes, then he attains awakening, which can be done from the first jhana. And I don't know if he attained the other three before he attained awakening. Certainly by his enlightenment, he could, and probably well before then it was the Buddha. But perhaps what's significant here, the question, sorry. And that when the Buddha remembers his child, it seems that it's a bit of a surprise to him that okay, would like to hear your thoughts on this, and also anything about this controversy. So yeah, the jhanas are not unique to Buddhism. I think other traditions have samma samadhi. But it also does seem like a surprise to him to sort of come back to where he'd kind of been. And yet, because of the spiritual faculties he'd cultivated, he was able to move very quickly through those refined states of wholesome concentration and pleasure. And most of us don't have to worry about those upper four immaterial attainments, as they're called. The jhanas are plenty for us to work on. So I hope that's enough. But I think more than any intellectual discussion of it, it just points to this motion of how important is for us to become acquainted with our somatic sense, our bodies again, and ground ourselves in them, whether that's through breath meditation, qigong, a bit of exercise, walking meditation. And that's so often that sort of pushing ourselves. We can take a leaf from the Buddha's book and just see how we do that, and sometimes just pulling back and being gentle. And that relates a bit to Rick's question. Can you share some practical ways we can maintain a healthy and balanced solo practice, and how to avoid common pitfalls? So I'd say this ethic of gentleness is big, and not pushing ourselves too hard, because we do that. but that's not so much a practical instruction, is it? Hmm. One thing I think people leave out of their practice a lot is time for retreat and getting into a monastery specifically. Most places have a monastery somewhat nearby. And if you step into that environment for even a few days, it provides a reference point for the rest of your life. If you don't have those moments of really stepping out of your life a bit, then the practice works on you, but there's rarely a moment either to have a bit of perspective and just a bit of distance, which allows usually those sort of seismic shifts that have been happening below the surface to suddenly really rise and to initiate actual action to see, oh God, it's time to give up that relationship. It's time to make this decision. I remember at the end of after my second year of college, I went off to a sort of ski hut in the Blue Mountains or the Wallowas, I can't remember, and just was there for about 4 days or so. But I was practicing at that point in my life, and those 3 or 4 days, like, just you could see this thought come up really strongly of like, I need to leave. I was at Reed at the time, and Reed College in Portland's a very rigorous school, but most of the people I was with were pretty miserable. At least I was, and just this thought came that I need to leave there. I need to go and so I switched to PSU, Portland State, and had time to meditate, to go outside, to work at a nonprofit. I was a much happier Nisabho, a much happier Nathan. And that story gets repeated again and again in people's lives, where they step into a monastery or retreat for a few days, and that deep knowledge has a chance to speak. So that's really important. You can fit that into your weeks through this Uposatha days. That's important too. That's the Sabbath day. So, in Thailand and elsewhere, and I've said this before, it's just very common to take that full moon, half moon, or quarter moon day, and that's the day you take the eight precepts you practice. You might find it better to align it with a weekday, say a Sunday, but you let people in your life know this is the day I practice. And the eight precepts are helpful on that day, because you're cutting yourself off from, for those who don't know the eight precepts, the first five precepts plus sexual misconduct, avoiding sexual misconduct is replaced by avoiding sexual conduct of any kind. Then there's avoiding adorning the body, scents, perfumes, avoiding entertainment, avoiding lying on higher luxury sleeping places, and I believe avoiding eating afternoon. A few of those are merged. But yeah, you simplify. You don't, you aren't going to dinner with anyone. Your body is light for meditation in the evening because you haven't been eating. You can have some sugar. Um, and you have more time. You've cut off entertainment, perhaps turned off the phone, just listen to Dhamma talks, and just having that reference point every week that this is the day I give to what's most important in my life. That's significant. And that allows, once again, it's that way of orienting all the other days around something meaningful. It gives you perspective. I think that's something people forget. Other practical means are, I heard Ajahn Suchita talking about this today, is having a little reminder every hour, taking a few 10-second breaks, just for 10 seconds, just breathing. And you can either just try to remember to do that, or you can set a little, buzzer on your phone or some little reminder um, to just stop. And 10-second break, everyone can fit those in. Or if there's an activity like going to the restroom, then just sort of tying that activity to the break. Uh, you know, if you work somewhere, say before you fill up the pitcher for the next customer, just, breathing. And Yeah, and then using your lunch breaks for something like that, even 5 minutes of meditation. But a lot of people do this is they put a, sign on their door that says, "Sorry, meditating." And that's what they do with their lunch. And people laugh at first, but in the end, people respect it, and it's a gift to others because they see that someone takes their practice that seriously. It's meaningful. That's what I got so far. Being gentle with ourselves is a big one. Listening to Dhamma talks. um, Cultivating the breath, cultivating the sound of silence as a meditation object that can be with you everywhere. It's really very powerful. Hello, Daniel. Can you explain born of seclusion and withdrawal? Is this referring to the hindrances or more literal? Hmm. So what Daniel's referencing here is the description of the first jhana, which is one experiences the pleasure and uh, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, um, accompanied by applied and sustained thought. And yes, before that description of the first jhana is said, there's a piece about one secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. So, yes, at this point, the hindrances of sensual desire, aversion, skeptical, sloth and torpor, uh, skeptical doubt, and I'm missing one. Anyone? Um, Whatever the fifth one is. Sorry, it's the fourth that I'm missing, but those drop. And restlessness and remorse. Sorry, Uttacha kukucha is the Pali. Yeah, those are gone, and one is secluded from sensual pleasures, and that seems to be what lets the mind draw in on itself. So a beautiful analogy of this is given in hmm, there's a constituent of experience called nama, which is mentality, and rupa, which is materiality. And nama is composed of five elements, more or less, which in a classic analogy is compared to the hand. So the pinky is feeling, Vedana. The ring finger is sanya, perception, because as soon as you have a perception of something, it locks that in. You see someone coming, and suddenly there's the, word, you know, anger, enemy. That deep perception of what that is and what that means comes up, and it crystallizes and sets off a whole cascade of responses and reactions. It's sort of that one word that really bubbles up, like it's your boss, say, and it's maybe the word is monster or friend, So you're marrying yourself to that. The middle finger's intention, Jetana, it is the longest finger, the strongest. In most cultures, this is sort of the pointer finger, actually, the middle finger. A little different for us. But intention is a really powerful element of nama. It's the part of ourselves that creates kama. All the others are sort of the results of kama. Our perceptions arise because of the kama we've cultivated and that which we are cultivating. But jetana, intention, that's the big one. Uh, Pointer finger is contact, and the thumb is attention, manas. So uh, usually the five elements, I've heard, this is mixing analogies a little bit, but Ajahn Sucitto's compared the manas, which is the sort of intellect in the mind. In Buddhism, the mind and heart are divided into two broad realms. There's manas, which is sort of intellect, and it's how we, the intellect, the mental faculties which go out and grab things, perceive them, bring them together. And then there's chitta, which is mind, heart, and that's the affective quality. That's the something much deeper. It's the part that tastes. It's the part that has intention. It's the part that feels. And Ajahn Suchitta compares that to the palm. It's what tastes things. So manas, the fingers, go out and they grab an object and they press it into the palm, into the chitta, and it tastes it. So our intellect goes out and it sees a sight and it perceives it, it has a reaction to it, and it brings that into the chitta. So you see the person you've just had an argument with enter the room, and there's the perception like enemy. There's the tightening of the body, the feeling of unpleasant sensation. There's the intention to fight, flight, or freeze, whatever. And that's all based on the sort of the contact with that impression. And all that impacts the chitta, and it tastes that and is affected and colored by it. So all that to say that as far as this analogy goes, and once again, we're mixing them a little bit because manas, I don't know if would explicitly, in one metaphor, manas is just the thumb. In the other, manas involves all of these Ajahn Suchittos. Either way, it kind of works. But where usually manas is grasping an object and pressing it into the palm, with samadhi and jhana, more and more the attention, the thumb, is holding without an object, just holding all the faculties together in one unified spot. So you're not grasping an object, rather attention is holding the rest into the chitta. And so all that to say that has to do with the seclusion, in that more and more you're not grasping this and that, even light impressions, but you're just holding everything together, and the mind is unifying without more and more into itself. And in the first jhana, there are other elements, but one of them is unification of mind, a koti bhavang, and yeah, that's relevant. So it doesn't have to be a literal seclusion, but in terms of someone can be in a public space and still be in jhana, but it is a sort of seclusion from these other sensual impressions and hindrances, the mind secluded in itself. Any other thoughts or questions? Thank you, Allison. Remorse and restlessness, yes. Good to see people. Anything people would like to discuss? Speaking about, all right, we can do that in a second. Speaking about this distinction between manas and chitta, I was just listening to an amazing talk by Longpa Suchitto, where he speaks about how chitta is not of the sense world. It's a creature of it's something else. It's not meant for that realm, but it's connected to that through manas. So manas, this intellect, gets sent out to grab things, and it's because the chitta is so hungry for something, and that's why intention comes from it. But it can never be satisfied because it's not by whatever manas gets. He compares it to chitta's like the blind boss in an office, and he tells manas, the attendant, go get me a latte, go get me lunch. But because chitta isn't of the sense realm, it can never be satisfied by what manas grabs. And particularly Longpa Suchitto, this is a talk he gave at DRBU, Dharma Realm Buddhist University, where he is speaking about the inner tyrant and how constantly the chitta wants to feel safe, cared for, loved. And so it sends out the manas, just looking for some sense of approval, for being good enough. And it can never find it because it's not out there. And how more and more this is why, but the chitta's at home with, say, loving kindness. That's a thing completely internal. Um, and how more and more a large part of our project in practice is to move into that duality, of sending manas out, because inevitably we have to. We live in the world. But noticing how we send manas out to find approval, to find affirmation. And instead of doing that, sending manas out with a sense of, may this be well. May this be well. That's our intention when we move into duality. And it doesn't have to be this abstract sense of moving into duality in some, unbelievably refined state of concentration. Just notice when you wake up. Just notice when you wake up what your intention, because your mind will begin to scramble for orientation. It'll move into this duality. Or when you open your eyes in meditation, when you hear the bell. So instead of thinking about the next thing you have to do, or this or that, can you move out into the world with a sense of blessing it? Because why else, what other reason would you have to move out into the world? That's our orientation. May this be well. I thought that was such a good reflection. We can't get love. It's impossible. That arithmetic never adds up. The ledger books never come out on your side in getting love. You can only give love, really. Because the chitta can cultivate that glow of connection internally, but and you can kind of sense it with others, but so frequently that can really be internal. And I remember I spent a year at a small monastery in Thailand, and I was so lonely. Like, it was very hard to be sort of the one Westerner and amongst, 3 or 4 Thais who didn't understand me completely. I was with an amazing teacher, but sort of one of the hidden great sages of Thailand. Um, I've told stories of him before, but people would bring things to be blessed by him, and he would bless them, and his hair would stand all up on end, and he'd say rapture. And similarly, there were sometimes tortoises. They released a tortoise in the monastery, and he had so much loving kindness that the tortoise just walked straight to his kuti and just waited in front of his door, staring at it. Sometimes after the meal, he would go down and take his leftovers and feed them to lines of ants. One of the most lovely men I've ever met, and really impressive meditation, I believe. Sorry, I shouldn't say that or can't say that, but just an amazing being. Anyways, I was still very lonely there. And the thing that changed it wasn't how much love I got. It was just beginning to really cultivate loving kindness meditation and realizing that when you give love, that satisfies the heart, because the chitta, that's where it gets its sense. It can't get it from manas. No matter how much that attendant goes out and grabs coffee or lasagna or whatever meal, the boss is never filled. What the boss can do is, well, gosh, I don't know what this metaphor goes. Maybe he cooks his own meal or just sits meditation for a time, but that makes him happy. Maybe he sends food out to someone else. Okay. Savaku Umaro, speak about bodhisatta and arahants. Why did the Buddha not teach how to become a Buddha? Oh man, that's a big one. This is a question that's come up a lot, and I don't know. I've heard Ajahn Amaro say there's a possibility that um, it is strange you don't find it in the suttas. I believe I've asked Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi this, and Ajahn Amaro has spoken about it, and they both found it very strange that in all the Pali Canon, no one asks the Buddha, "How do you become a Buddha?" Um, and so, there was some conjecture that maybe when that split between the Mahayana and the Theravada happened, certain parts were taken out of the texts. But Ajahn Jayasaro said he doubts that. I mean, just looking at how faithful these redactors were to the text, it's hard to imagine them just pushing aside something completely. So I'm not sure. Yeah, my sense is it's not terribly important to go into too deeply. People really get caught up in this duality of arahant or bodhisattva. My sense is, I know Theravada monks in these robes that are practicing to be bodhisattvas, to continue on. And I don't know what I'm completely, eventually I would, enlightenment is the aim, but I've just followed where that intuitive sense of the Dhamma has led me, and these teachings resonated, and I don't see the practice as different in its essence, at least at my stage. Um, I believe sort of even if you want to cultivate, say, these high states of loving kindness, you're not going to be able to do a lot of that until you get your breath meditation together. So once you begin attaining first, second, the jhanas, then maybe there's a little more maybe this is a more relevant discussion, but for most of us, just you know follow your heart and intuition and trust the Dhamma to guide you. And my sense is that a lot of these distinctions are they can get in the way of that intuitive feel of what you really connect with and what your practice should be. So I don't know about the text completely, but for each of us, I'd say to not get too caught up in it intellectually is helpful. Can you share a few practical examples from your practice, how you were able to break free from mindlessly flowing along in the 12 links of dependent origination? So the 12 links begin with avidya, ignorance. Specifically, it's ignorance of the Four Noble Truths as an applied skill. So that is hard to absorb it all, but it's really helpful to realize that. It's ignorance of the Four Noble Truths as an applied skill. So what we're doing is we're developing the ability to comprehend suffering, to see it, to let go of the cause, to sort of realize cessation and to develop the path. And when we don't have that skill, then we we don't see the suffering in going out. And so our mind goes out and seeks and pushes things away or pulls them close. It's constantly hungry and seeking because we don't see how that motion of intention makes us suffer. So as you see it, you stop doing it. And you can see that very clearly in external ways. As you practice, maybe you see that like actually going out to the club, it doesn't attract you anymore. It's speaking as a monk, but it's noisy, it's dirty, people are, yelling at each other to be heard. It's not fun. You used to like it, but now you see the dukkha. And that keeps happening. And it happens with meditation objects too. You follow the breath in and out at the nose for the first few steps of Anapanasati Sutta, but then it becomes more coarse and too much, back and forth, and suddenly there's this refined energy flowing through the body, and that's more refined. So you let go of the dukkha of that more coarse object and move up. And all this to say that that cycle of dependent origination, as we see those coarse modes of intention, conditioned by ignorance, more and more clearly, our attention refines, and we're still caught in that cycle to some extent, but it becomes lighter and lighter and lighter. So yes, we still have intention. We still, move out into the world. We have contact. We have craving, but more and more we're aiming it towards something really beautiful. And there's a wonderful sutta called Transcendent dependent origination, or it details this process where instead of you move through the 12 links to death, and then in suffering, and instead of it leading back into ignorance, it leads to faith, and faith leads to, I believe, effort or joy. And these lead on through pleasure, concentration, vision of release. It leads you onto the path. And that's a useful dynamic to see that it's almost like we're spinning one way or the other. Like no matter what, we're caught in these circles because we're in this realm. So often it's not just kind of attenuating the things that we know we shouldn't be caught in, but it's really cultivating this other set of links of faith and effort, because our hearts want to pour themselves into something. Just this morning, someone was speaking to me about how, you know, before practice, there just was this sense of, all these difficult patterns and habits emerging in her life and becoming stronger and stronger, uh, really painful ones, compulsive ones. And we all have that. The years go by and the addictions accumulate, and the suffering does too. And my sense is like we move past that not just by seeing the suffering in them, but also the heart wants to pour itself into something. And if it doesn't have a real path, a riverbed deep enough for it, it will fracture itself and flow out in all these tributaries. I remember in college, because I had nothing to give my heart to, you know, I was doing good things, but I would still need to like binge on movies, whatever, do this and that, look for a romantic relationship. And that all just stopped when I found a way to align myself with Dhamma completely. And for me, that meant robes, but it won't mean that for everyone. And so my sense is a lot of those 12 links of suffering, um, they're still going to be at work, but there's a way of conceptualizing things where the heart's motion, pouring it into that wheel of transcendent dependent origination, pouring it into this path will at least make that cycle of craving, suffering, lighter. The heart will pour itself into things unworthy of it less because it's found something worthy. My mom and dad talk about meeting some friends who had just retired, and talking about how they'd been looking for a new house and how they discovered that the really important thing was the view. And I like that because it's so close to the truth. If they just had that term right view, but they're talking about the view from their patio, of course, and property values. And one of my relatives, sort of caught at the moment in remodeling the house again and again, just to say that we need purpose, and people find very silly things to aim for inevitably because the heart needs something, but um, giving it something worthy of aiming for, that's how you save yourself. That helps so much. So yeah, there's developing the ability to see suffering in our current habits, but there's also developing very wholesome habits. And on some refined level, that development of wholesome habits also partakes of those 12 links, but it can be helpful to conceptualize them in terms of that other transcendent path, and realize that we pour ourselves into the path, and then we have to pour ourselves less into the other things. So that was quite a lot, but I think we have run out of time. So thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see everyone. Theo, it's been a while. Good to see everyone, really, though. And we have our weekly Zoom session now. So you can go to the website, clearmountainmonastery.org, and go down the page and click on the Zoom link, or I'll paste it in the chat. And the Zoom's from 6:45 to 7:30. And yeah, if you're in Seattle, consider joining us for our Saturday gatherings at St. Mark's, 9:30 to 12. And one last thing is we got to visit Longpa Pasano last week on a Wednesday. And one of the best quotes that I've heard in a long time he gave to us that day. Someone was asking about a certain thing the Buddha said, and Longpa Pasano said that the Buddha didn't teach doctrine, he taught human beings that were suffering. I thought that was very good. See you all later.